of our MEI Second Annual Futures Forum here. I'm Stephen Kenny, the Director of the Strategic Foresight Initiative Program here at MEI in Washington, D.C. And we have a terrific panel set up here to talk about the future of sustainable cities in the Middle East and North Africa region. We've got a great group of panelists. Let me quickly introduce them, and then we will jump into our conversation. First, we have Karim Elgendi. Karim is an urban sustainability and climate consultant based in London. He's the founder and coordinator of Karbun, which is an advocacy initiative promoting sustainabilities in cities of the Middle East and North Africa through research and communication. He's also an associate director at Bureau Happold, supporting clients around the world on issues of urban sustainability and resilience, climate policy, energy transition, urban metabolism, and the circular economy. Karim, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
We also have with us today Adam Jambroni. Adam is a senior advisor on land mobility and transportation in the city of Neom in Saudi Arabia, and he's now also the head of the roads division there in Neom. He's been a groundbreaking, innovative transit and mobility official and advisor in cities around the world, including Toronto, New York City, Milwaukee, Khartoum, and others around the world. Adam, thank you for being here today.
It's a pleasure.
We have two other panelists who will be joining us in progress. Let me introduce them now, and then we'll have them join us as they come in. Shortly, we'll have Melissa Ingaruca Moreno. Melissa is a researcher and designer in multi-species urbanism, nature-based solutions, and climate-neutral cities and urban sustainability transformations. She's also the recent winner of the main award in the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Program at the School of International Futures in London for her work in this area. Finally, hopefully joining us shortly will be Sarah El-Batouti. Sarah is the founder and CEO of eConsult, which is a green architecture firm based in Cairo, Egypt. As well, she is a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Global Ambassador and an advisor to the president, to cabinet ministries in Egypt. I think you will all be really happy with what we're hearing from all of our panelists today as we look to the future of sustainable cities in the Middle East and North Africa. Karim, if I could start with you, and you've worked on urban development and sustainability projects around the world, not only in the Middle East and North Africa, but in Europe, North America, and sub-Saharan Africa. What are some of the common opportunities and challenges where innovations and ideas from one context can benefit cities in other contexts? And what are some of the opportunities and challenges that are really more distinctive to the MENA region?
Sure. Obviously, one has to start with the challenges first. Around the world, the primary challenges we have to deal with existing cities is the issue of density. Low density cities or urban sprawl, suburbia, whatever you'd like to call it, is a fundamental challenge that to the transition towards sustainability in general, climate action. So alongside that comes the issue of single-use planning and how do you transition cities from single-use functions to mixed-use planning. And then you have to also retrofit existing cities, for example, American cities. Historically, many cities in the MENA region, but not anymore, have tended to lack public transportation and sort of a network for walking and cycling, or active mobility as it is known. So retrofitting cities to integrate those or weave those networks in is a fundamental challenge. Existing buildings tend to have low energy efficiency, especially if the climate demands a lot of heating or cooling. Alongside with that, you get climate change adaptation. So retrofitting buildings, not just for efficiency, but also in preparation for a changing climate. In other cities, the challenges are different. So it depends really on the fundamentals of why the city is there, and what kind of infrastructure is there. But you get issues like, how do you source water from sustainable sources? How do you source energy from sustainable sources? How do you manage stormwater, especially in the context of climate change resilience? The MENA region specifically is quite a unique place. It's highly urbanized. 2/3 of the region live in cities already, which is high the global average. Not as high as North America or Europe, but still pretty high. Excuse me. But cities of the region have not use this urbanization to achieve the socioeconomic benefits that can come with that come with agglomeration, with network effect, with economies of scale. So what we had seen is in the last 40 years, and the 40 years perhaps to the Paris Agreement, we'd seen urbanization has been increasing, which is great, tends to increase density in cities and bring all those theoretical benefits to a population. But also urbanization has been increasing alongside of that. And unfortunately, despite the increase in urban to rural migration, increase in urban populations, what we have seen is emissions have also been increasing, and they've been increasing on all fronts. Perhaps the MENA region is the only region in the world where we've seen total emissions increase over those 40 years, emissions per capita increase over those 40 years, and emissions per dollar of GDP has been on the increase as well. No other region in the world has that issue. So one would argue that the cities of the region have not benefited from that trend of urbanization. They've not benefited from these agglomeration benefits, the economies of scale or the network effect that comes with urbanization. The cities also of the region also have a unique challenge in that they are fundamentally challenged by a certain level of vulnerability and a certain challenge in terms of the resilience to change. They have structural vulnerabilities. For example, they're always dependent on one source of water or two sources of energy, and mostly one mobility mode, which is private cars. But they're also highly at risk of climate change. They'll get twice as much increase in temperature compared to the global average. It's a fairly coastal region. Tens of millions of people living near the coast, 100 kilometers away from the coast. So sea level rise is a major issue. There's wet bulb temperature increase around the Gulf, which has tremendous impacts on health by the end of this century and potentially fatal. And there's the issue of increased storms coming from the Indian Ocean. The other fundamental challenges in terms of resilience of cities of the region is population growth. So a lot of them are socioeconomic: population growth, migration and displacement within the same country, and conflict. Conflict sometimes it happens in cities, as we had seen in the Syria conflict. What that means is, in the unique setup of the MENA region, the region has to deal with both sustainability and resilience at the same time. And it has to develop a unique model for that development. The standard European North American steady state notion of sustainability, which is that cities can sort of slowly transition away from their current model into a more efficient one that's really just not applicable in a place like the MENA region, cities of a place like the MENA region. And the region isn't applicable is because they're susceptible to these shocks and stresses, like population growth, which is faster than other places in the world, migration, conflict, and extreme weather events. So we can't really apply that steady state notion of transition to sustainability. And similarly, the resilience model, again, quite popular in North America, of helping cities recover and restore the functionality following a shock or a stress, for example, like a hurricane, which is where the first notions of resilience were popularized. That, if applied in the MENA region, means that you're restoring regional cities to the original state, which was unsustainable in the first place. So what you really need to do is to kind of manage these shocks and stresses, or manage your resilience in a way that kind of gets you to a more sustainable state, and vice versa. In terms of innovation, we've seen quite good advances in a number of fronts. A lot of them are technological in nature. We've seen desalination improve in terms of the cost per cubic meter in Israel, Algeria, and we've also seen an improvement not just in cost in Saudi Arabia, but also in terms of reducing brine discharge to sea, which is the second primary issue associated with the desalination. We also saw a region-wide drop, if you like, in the cost of renewable energy sources. 1 cent per kilowatt hour, and for solar, 2 cents for wind per kilowatt hour. We also seen some financial innovation in ways in which building retrofits, which are always quite a difficult issue because there are different typologies, the way that these have been financed. So we've seen development of the energy service companies, for example, that found innovative ways in which those can be financed. And we've seen some design development. The new notions such as green infrastructure have found its way to provide a range of benefits across cities, from stormwater management to improving outdoor thermal comfort, to improving water efficiency, etc. We've seen a plethora of micro-mobility projects that have found their way all around the world, including the region. So e-bikes, e-scooters, and increasing interest in walkability and cyclability. Although it's still from a really low base, but it's moving on. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you. One of the really important and interesting things I heard you saying there that I hope we'll come back to throughout the conversation is the speed and urgency with which the transition to a different urban model needs to happen in the region relative to elsewhere in the world. Urban redevelopment and retrofitting obviously is not something that can be done quickly, easily. So that poses, I think, a really unique challenge to how do we accelerate the process of making these transitions. Adam, let me turn to you. And Karim talked about retrofitting existing cities in the case of Neom and other cities that are sort of being built from scratch, as Neom is. You have the advantage of being able to design in sustainability innovations from day one, rather than having to think about retrofitting. I wonder if you could talk about what are some of the key features or attributes that are being designed into Neom from a sustainability standpoint.
Well, I guess picking up on what Karim was talking about is the design of cities and the design of the places we live play a huge part in how the cities or our houses or whatnot are actually sustainable. So in a city where you're starting from scratch, you're able to really lay out the primary focus of your city in such a way that it actually encourages sustainability. So that includes where you're placing your places to live and work and play and all of those things in a way that really reduces the need for people, for example, to use any sort of transportation other than their 2 feet. And especially in a region like the Middle East, however, you have to really think about that. I mean, obviously, in places where we have 45 degrees Celsius temperatures in the summer, just taking a stroll between your house and down to your work, even if it's only 10 or 15 minutes, might not be the most pleasant experience. But if you are starting from scratch with this mentality, as cities did traditionally in the region going back hundreds of years, looking back to almost history to design the cities of the future, tight, compact communities that allow for that easy walking between places in a few minutes, with the 5 and even 15-minute city, make that sustainability option a realistic proposition, because you don't have to get people into cars. They can walk to where they want to do. People don't want to necessarily hop in a car and go everywhere. They may prefer a car to other modes, but if you can really get most in work in the community where you live, this makes the question of sustainability a lot easier. And it's not that radical an idea. As I say, these were actually how cities were designed for hundreds, if not thousands of years, because there was very few other ways of getting around. Rome itself was limited in size by how much you could walk around the city, because they or take a horse cart or whatnot. So Neom in some ways looks towards the future, and other cities like Neom in terms of using advanced technologies, whether that is for energy creation, in terms of renewable power, or in terms of the actual modes it uses. But at the core of it actually are some pretty basic fundamentals that I might argue haven't really changed for hundreds of years, have been updated, adapted, but looking to the actual built environment for cues on how you would design it. So as we think about mobility and other things in Neom, it really has to be informed by the realities that we are in a desert region with a coast, that we have a certain climatic pattern that is a little bit better than elsewhere in the Gulf in terms of things, but the fundamentals are the same. And so as these communities are design communities that have been announced, like Oxagon and Trojena, when you look at them, they actually look like very, in some ways, modern adaptations of traditional city concepts that have been proven to work over thousands of years.
And what are some of those fundamentals that have been, maybe in a modernized manifestation as Neom is being conceptualized and built, that are potentially adaptable into already built cities where that retrofitting is so important?
Well, there are some, as Kareem was talking about, the Middle East features some cities that, if not brand new, I mean, Dubai has been around for hundreds of years, but it was a small village for most of that period. If you look at it in terms of the what other cities in the region have had to do in terms of going back to these fundamentals. So Dubai is a good example where they have invested billions of dollars over the last 10 years since the opening of their metro in sort of creating walkability, looking at some of their newer communities that are more of these take designs from the past and make them more integrated communities, reducing the needs to commute. Now it's hard. Dubai is a good example of a city that's done a very good job in terms of trying to adapt their city. Obviously, it brought a metro. Qatar, with the World Cup being the most recent example of opening a metro, but not just, investing a lot in some of those just really basic technologies like sidewalks, in terms of being able to allow people to get out and do things, and creating the urban design. So you can put sidewalks, you can make it very nice, but if you haven't structured your property, so if you don't, for example, have storefronts that face onto pedestrianized areas, if those storefronts aren't of the right size to encourage a mixture of shops, right? If you don't have the right size for a supermarket, you're going to get a small store, you won't get a supermarket. Similarly, there's all this, so you're going to need a mixture of that urban design. NEOM is doing that as well, looking at these patterns. Again, it's not, in some ways it's not very radical, but on the other hand, if you look at it, the combination of these basic principles being put together, combined with large investments in mobility to allow people, because not everything you want is always going to be within a 5-minute walk. So you are going to need to have things like technology, like trains, high-speed trains. You're going to need to use things like the new drones for deliveries. Those sort of new technologies allow you to take the basic principles and then expand them out and integrate them all together. So I think maybe if you want to say one of the visions or the radical points about NEOM is takes some really basic fundamentals that aren't new at all, but then it combines it with some of these new adaptive technologies to actually create these communities that are not just strong communities in terms of how they interact, but also allow people to still do those different activities and go out into the different parts of NEOM, because it's 26,000 square kilometers. So we've had to think about a lot about both, and then how we use renewable power to do that. So how, when you are going to go out of that 5-minute or 15-minute walking zone, doing it in such a way that can be environmentally friendly, can be sustainable, and can be affordable, because a lot of the technology that has been proposed in places is great for 1 or 2% of the population, but cities, if they're going to be successful, have to be successful for hundreds, if not millions of people, and have to do that in an affordable way, because otherwise it becomes a boutique type technology that is really cool to look at, is great to think about, but isn't necessarily applicable for the 95+% of the population that would have to use them every day.
Kareem, how do you see some of these advanced technologies that Adam is talking about being used, or potentially could be used in very large, very dense, already built cities in the region?
Sorry, which technology specifically are you advocating for? Sorry.
Well, you referenced in the first question response, mobility in particular, but also renewable energy and a couple of other things that you talked about when you were speaking earlier.
It's all subject to technical challenges. So the technologies for solar and wind, for example, are particularly challenged within urban context. This is quite evident in every project where there's huge aspirations to source the energy specifically from renewable energy sources for this particular development, this particular neighborhood, this particular city, and only to realize that perhaps that's not the best place to do it, and we could do that somewhere else and dedicate it exclusively. But the idea that solar is great in cities is beneficial from a decentralization point of view, risk reduction point of view, but it's not the most effective way, nor the most efficient way to do it. Ideally, you want to do a utility scale. Wind is particularly challenging in the urban context, because of the disruption, the texture that is created on the ground plane as a result of the buildings and the landscape. While in an open area, you will get less of that. Desalination by its very nature happens at the coast, and as a result, you'll need to move that away from the urban areas, and also find ways in which you can address, hopefully not discharge, the byproducts that come out of that, namely the brine. And also, if you want to do that sustainably, then you'll finding ways in which you could use renewable energy sources to power that. Associated renewable energy sources could better be placed near that. The reason the mobility has done so well, I think, is partly because of the availability of data and the use of AI and other technologies to power those systems and make the user experience so much better. And the availability of data, geospatial data, as a result of using these systems, the ability to analyze those gives it an advantage over every other technology. And I think what the step change that we had seen is because smart city technologies need data, and what sector generates more data than mobility? I don't think any other sector, urban sector, produces as much data. Just the geospatial data of people moving around. So assessing those, analyzing those, and providing best routes, providing a better experience for users has been a great advantage for micromobility, but also for other public transportation measures. So we've seen that implementation of those public transportation, trains. We've seen the implementation of those in some of the door-to-door mobility networks, such as Uber and the like. So there's ways, but it really all comes down to that specific technology and the application within a given context. In some places, they come up against rules and regulations. For example, here in London, we're not allowed to use e-scooters, but we're not allowed to use any kind of e-scooters. But now we're allowed to use the ones that you can hire, but you can't buy one and use it anywhere in the UK. It's just laws that prevent you from doing it on the main roads and also from doing it on the sidewalk or the pavement. In other countries, this is not particularly a challenge. The setup of every city is different, and as a result, the legal framework and the technical needs for the city is also different. Some technologies are fairly straightforward. So integrated building management systems at building scale that tend to be fairly straightforward for new buildings. As a matter of fact, integrating new technologies into new buildings is probably the easiest thing to do. Of all the other things that are out there, the trouble is dealing with existing stock, building stock, and dealing with existing mobility networks. It's changing those that is the fundamental challenge, and technologies can help, but they won't fix this. They can attempt to transition or pick up all the little inefficiencies that can be rectified using technologies, but the fundamentals put a ceiling on how much you can improve those, unfortunately.
Is it a matter of actually undoing some of the infrastructure that is present, or adapting it to a different context and other technologies that are trying to be sort of layered onto it, for lack of a better way to put it?
Adapting it would achieve a marginal benefit, which could have associated carbon reductions. Redoing implies demolishing and rebuilding, which has its own consequences in terms of embedded carbon that will come with that. So that wouldn't be recommended either. As a matter of course, redoing in cities is not just an operational issue; it's a balance between the operational and the capital emissions, if you like, of the known as the embodied carbon that comes with the with adding the new infrastructure or the new assets that are being replaced.
Stephen, if I could just maybe jump in for just a quick add to this. I mean, one of the challenges, I think, or one of the advantages, of course, we talk about in these new cities is everything it's greenfield, right? So you don't have to adapt something, you have to put it in. But one of the challenges, I think, is, or the pressures I would think I feel, is you have to basically guess at what's going to happen. Now, you may have the plans, you know where things are going to be built, but these patterns that develop in cities. So when you look at these cities that have been around literally for cases hundreds, if not thousands of years, you've developed really strong patterns. And so you have a real sense of both the culture of people in that area, what they're going to do. Now it changes over time, but you can see where they're going. The desire lines, if you will, are already there. So, in a city, you may know where all the buildings are going to go. You have the population densities. You don't necessarily, it doesn't always, of course, develop, even though you develop, for example, apartments for certain types of people or families, doesn't necessarily that will guarantee how they get built out. And people's patterns today, we have to anticipate where they're coming and make the investments. And the challenge is, of course, and this happened in the past, but you have to put all your sort of eggs in one basket, if you will, in terms of when you're building rail lines or pieces of micro-mobility, sure, it can adapt, pick up, move it around, maybe doesn't even need stations. But for some of the, I guess I feel some of the pressure when you actually are having to guess at population projections and types of people who are going to move into a city, because once you make those large investments, it's really hard to, there is money to build out, but if you don't get it right, and you won't know this for 20 years, there is that pressure there. Whereas at least in a city, places I've worked, Toronto and New York, I know the challenges from a transportation perspective. I can tell you where well, at least my own opinion, but as the transit agencies and things like that could probably give you a pretty good prioritization of where the next 10 investments should go. And if you have $1 billion or 10 billion or 30 billion or more, there would be this fairly agreed upon prioritization. And that's a challenge in a brand new city, because you're really making a lot of educated guesses. And I guess we'll see how good we are when we have this discussion in 30 years later at this conference.
Well, I think those are really important points, Adam, and I think actually a very nice transition to bringing Melissa into the conversation. Melissa, are you able to hear us?
Yes, yes, Steven. Oh, wait, are you here double?
Yes, we can hear you as well.
Are you hearing my voice with echo or?
No, not too much.
Oh, okay, sorry, it's just me. Because I have it in the phone on the computer. I'm gonna leave the phone. Okay. And said, okay, I'm good with the audio now. Sorry, I'm connecting from the airport at the moment. Yes, I was trying to listen to some of the conversation, but maybe you can just introduce me to where exactly are you, what point of the discussion, and yeah, I'm happy to join.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for joining us today. I introduced you at the top of the session. Adam, so we've been talking about, on the one hand, some of the challenges of retrofitting existing cities to make them more sustainable. And Kareem has talked about what some of those challenges are and some of the issues associated with that. We've also talked about, in the case of NEOM, where Adam is, creating a city from scratch and not needing to retrofit, but as you just pointed out, Adam, needing to sort of make very good educated guesses about the things you need to do, since you are working in the greenfield. But the patterns that you talked about, Adam, I think are so important, and what I think is the nice transition to Melissa's perspective. Melissa, in your work and some of our prior conversations, you've talked about challenging and disrupting some of the dominant worldviews and narratives about what a city is and how we develop and design cities. I think those patterns that you're talking about, Adam, are reflective of ideas and worldviews that we all have and have carried for generations and hundreds of years about what a city is and what it should be and what it could be. Melissa, what are some of those dominant worldviews and narratives that you focus on in your work? And what are some of the alternative worldviews that you think really need to come to the fore if we want to create a different kind of built environment, both in new cities and in cities that are being redeveloped with true sustainability in mind?
Thank you, Stephen, for this nice introductory question for me. I feel maybe I should clarify where is it that I focus my work in relation to worldviews, and this context is the context of sustainability transformation. And then there are many approaches to kind of understanding what a transformation could be. One of those is the entry point of culture, and just being a bit critical of the paradigms of urban design and architecture that have seeded existing cities that we have today. And so going into the future and not just into the construction of new cities, but also in let's say addressing the current challenges of existing cities that we have, how can we find, as you say, alternative ways of thinking in the design field specifically. So I think in general, people might be very familiar with the idea of modernist architecture and modernist thinking, and a lot of that is reflected. I mean, it's not just something in the abstract, but it's reflected in this dualism between nature and built environment, and nature and people in every city that we see today. And so this, I would say that there are many things that are part of that thinking, but I just would focus. It's nice to focus just on one aspect, which is this anthropocentrism that we see in cities. And so this dualistic vision of cities and nature, I think it's really something that we need to bridge. And there are many design approaches that are helping us to bridge that, and things like multi-species justice or post-anthropocentric design can be an entry point to that. So for example, if we think about who are the clients of, let's say, the clients of cities or the clients of an architecture construction, it's pretty obvious that it's normally focused on human needs. And so going forward, I think we need to consider nature as a client, as also that also we consider the outcome that will be in of other species and the integrity of different ecosystems. So in that, what that could mean in a specific setting is that we take into account what other species are part of the city, but also we can look at that in thinking that bigger ecosystems like the Amazon or climate are also part of that nature. So multi-species thinking is not so much about focusing on specific entities such as species either of that flora or fauna, but is thinking about what are also processes that we need to take into account when we design and take and make design choices. And one of the things that I think it's interesting is that we're seeing that a lot of new cities will be built in areas that are hotspots of biodiversity today. So we can see that in the rainforest belt, for example, and there are many places, and we can see the example of Indonesia with this project of the new capital, Nusantara, which is going to be placed in Borneo. So I don't know how much you're familiar with what's happening in Borneo Island, but basically it is it's an island that used to have maybe 80 years ago or 90 years ago, the complete island was rainforest, and this the trend of deforestation has been speeding up throughout the last decades. And so this question, okay, now we're going to have a new capital there. How is this going to either just push that trend of deforestation forward or contribute to the restoration of that ecosystem? So for example, in that context, bringing a multi-species thinking into it would have to do a lot with wondering how many species already are in danger, have lost habitat, have been displaced because of human activities, and also which ecosystems in general, the rainforest as a whole, but in this area where Nusantara, for example, will be placed, we have mangroves and coral reefs that also are going to be part of the city development area. So there are bigger questions there in terms of how the design choices that are taken are not just going to be for the outcome of well-being of people but actually to bring also restoration and multi-species justice to the ecosystems that already existed there. And I think this is, I mean, now it's maybe quite general, but I just wanted to say that in all these alternative worldviews that we have, of course, there are also local, specific local worldviews of even indigenous traditions and so on, but even within larger Western thought, we can find already post-anthropocentric thinking in design that I think it's interesting to see as an overall approach, how it can translate into technical decisions, into design choices that we're making in the context, in this case, of building new cities, just with the example of Nusantara. But yeah, I can take it to other direction, but just as an intro, I wanted to bring that.
No, great. I think that's really important, right? Again, we think of cities in terms of places to serve primarily human needs, but I think taking this other perspective into account, and we have, parks and things like that in many cities of the world where we try to take other dimensions into account. But I think you're talking about it at a different level. I want to take it back to you in just a moment, Adam, to connect to something Melissa was just talking about. Before I do, I want to tell those in our audience, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you would like to submit questions, we are going to set time aside at the end of this session for questions from the audience. So please use that Q&A function to add your questions, and we will get to those later on. But Adam, to bring it back to you, in reflecting on what Melissa was just talking about, when you and I talked a couple weeks ago, you told me something that I did not know and did not anticipate about NEOM, which is the vast amount of the landmass there that is actually set aside as nature preserve rather than as the developed part of the city. I hope you could talk about that. What was the decision making that led to that choice, and would that nature have been protected and in the same way if the development was not made? Just talk a little bit about the balance between the developed area and the really quite vast amount of the area there that's being set aside for nature.
Well, the advantage, both the challenges and advantages of the location of NEOM is it was a relatively underdeveloped region within Saudi Arabia, and so it had low population densities, low infrastructure quantities, fairly, most, I don't know the percentage of the landscape, but most of it was really essentially its native form. And so what that presented is both a huge challenge, because in a lot of areas around the world, even new cities or new areas can piggyback a little bit on infrastructure. But in NEOM, a lot of that will have to have been laid down. So new water, electrical, and then we come back to transportation infrastructure. The other thing I would say is that by making these decisions, and I think there was a desire to focus on the sustainability, and sprawl really makes it very difficult. I mean, to be able to provide effective, efficient, both from an environmental but also a cost factor for infrastructure. We see this in the traditional suburbs, which are really expensive to build out from an infrastructure perspective, expensive to maintain, right? Just because you have less, people who are contributing per square kilometer, whether that be for water, roads, electrical, really every type of infrastructure. So going forward, I mean, we've seen traditionally, and going back to the point on history, cities were, at some point constrained either by walking distance or even just the need to put the infrastructure of defense, a wall, right, which is very expensive to do, and you obviously can only defend so much. So whatever the pressures were that led to these compact cities traditionally, we really got away from that in the 20th century when the general wealth in large parts of the world and technology allowed us to really spread out, and then I guess the desire from to escape some of the cities that had not, did not have the great livability in the city. So the challenge here with NEOM is to create great livability, right, in cities that are dense. Now, we've seen good examples of this around the world where, some of the great, I think, generally accepted great cities have fairly dense cores. However, those same cities also generally have very large expanses of suburban reaches. And this goes from places in Europe like London or Paris. You have places like Tokyo. I mean, really every region of the city or every region of the planet has these combinations. So the challenge here in NEOM is, and I think the opportunity is, by restricting the development down to 5% of the total landmass, what you do is you force that creativity, you force that density, which we know creates vibrant cities. And by doing that, what you're able to do is make it more efficient from both, I guess, a financial perspective, but also environmental perspective. And you give the opportunity for people to really get out into nature much easier. So if you think about the line that was announced there, you basically can step out of the line, right, into an environment that and enjoy the benefits of that environment. And that's true of the other communities being proposed. Whereas traditionally, just getting out to the cottage, getting out to a recreation area in a lot of cities can mean travel of a couple hours to get past the suburbs. So that's, I mean, so I think the focus here is within NEOM allows the preservation of a quite remarkable and stark environment. It provides the focus for efficient and effective infrastructure development, as well as the efficient running of it, because it takes energy to build, but also energy to run. And the hope here is that you can replicate some of what we've learned make great cities over the last couple hundred years, and try to avoid some of the mistakes, I'd say, of the 20th century, where we did do that massive grow out in terms of suburbs, and trying to take the best of both worlds from those environments, as well as the dense urban centers. So we'll see. As going back to my other comment, of course the challenge is that these are experiments. They're bold experiments. They're exciting, but they are exactly that. And time will tell what people get right, and of course what we get wrong.
Kareem, to bring it back to you, one of the things you first talked about earlier in this conversation was sort of climate resilience, climate adaptation in cities in the region. I think another of the, I'll call it sort of dominant worldviews as we think about climate change adaptation and mitigation is a very sort of like national level and sort of central government sort of driving of the agenda for what that looks like. You recently co-authored a policy paper in which you laid out proposals for delegating powers from central governments and national level governments down to cities for them to drive actions that would integrate climate change adaptation into the local planning and create kind of a parallel G20 city network structure. Let me ask you to talk about that. What would that look like, and how can we accelerate the decentralization of power and resources down to city authorities in the region so that they can drive their own sustainable development and sustainable urban development agendas?
Sure. I mean, I'm pretty sure our audience here has not read the policy paper on the G20, but so I'll have to explain why we're thinking that. Today, what we have is a situation where 70%, so 67 to 72%, according to the IPCC, of all emissions come from cities. 84% of the pledges under the Paris Agreement, known as the nationally determined contributions, recognize cities as having a role within the climate action. So cities are quite central, and cities can also reduce their emissions by up to 90% for fraction, $2 trillion, and you can reduce your emissions by 90%. Of course, $2 trillion is easier said than done, but it's a small percentage of the global GDP. Yet, what we have is a world where cities really have their hands tied. They only are in control of 14% of the carbon reduction potential. If cities wanted to do something without central governments, they can only achieve 14% of all the potential, simply because of the powers that they have relative to central governments. Additionally, what we have is cities feeling that they're outside of the process in terms of the global climate governance, if you like. Cities are observers to the negotiating process. We were done with the negotiation back in the Paris Agreement. There were some rule book details that needed to be sorted out back in Glasgow. But since then, we really are done. It's time for action, time to get that implemented. And so the implementation stage started about a year ago. Yet, cities are still observers to the process. They're still on the sidelines watching things unfold. They've managed to find ways to get around this. They've created some networks between city to city, in which they can sort of do peer-to-peer learning, and which they can get together and lobby for influence within that global climate governance system. The Marrakesh Partnership allows the integration of non-parties like businesses, like cities, like regions, and cities have used some of that, but they remain at the periphery. In the MENA region, things are more acute. Cities have even less power on climate issues than that. They cannot really address the main issues that they really should be able to address better than central governments. In highly centralized countries of the MENA region, I will not name names, cities have no powers. It's by governorate or by districts, national districts. So as a result, what we have is cities really don't have the powers to do it. We've seen some examples for decentralization. Morocco is perhaps the leading example. Decentralization laws give municipalities some competences to address energy, water, and mobility, all at local scale. But what we are calling for here in this policy paper is a multi-level governance system. The global governance structure that we have for climate is driven by what we call the parties, which are mostly countries in the EU. So it's driven by a national scale action. But cities and other levels of governance need to be brought in. Excuse me, sorry, I'm recovering from something. So any individual element of climate action can be addressed at a certain scale. That could be private business scale, it could be done at city scale or national scale. What we are calling for is creating that multi-level governance system in which things are addressed at the best scale. And powers need to be transferred, competence need to be transferred to that scale. And finance is also another element to this. Cities and other non-state potential players in this climate governance system don't access finance. As a matter of fact, most cities don't have creditworthiness to allow them to access climate finance. So cities need to not just be given the powers, but also given the money that they need to do that. I think I'll stop there because I'm a little bit struggling there with the call.
Thank you. Melissa, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this idea as well, this empowerment. What does empowerment, or what should empowerment down to not just the city level, but to the people within the cities in the future? What does that look like to you, or what should it look like?
Yes, and before I go to this question, I just wanted to add something to the general question before of cities and climate action. Just to say that I think one trend that is still a bit overlooked is the accounting of the emissions. And so when we see all these big goals of carbon neutrality by 2050, most of times by 2040 for something, for some ambitious cities, we still need to ask the question of what emissions are being counted, because usually it is the case that only the territorial emissions, so these production-based emissions, are counted, and what's left outside is the consumption-based emissions, which comes from every product and every emission across the value chain of different things, from clothing, electronics, to even also the embedded emissions in the building sector. So these emissions are for some cities, and I want to remember the numbers, but I just remember the figures now, but in some cities are double of what the production-based emissions are. So I remember this was the case, I think, for London, and close to double also in Beijing, I think it was. So just to say that these goals of carbon neutrality, they cannot leave a big portion of those emissions out. So also taking into account these consumption-based emissions, what it means for cities is that we are actually addressing something that is more connected to the lifestyle, the urban lifestyle. So that means also a question on design in the sense that how is design going to enable a more local food production, for example, or what is going to be the relationship with new cities and future patterns of consumption. Because so far, I mean, even if we see some examples of foreign cities, I'm going to just mention the ones in my own country, that a lot of the public space is kind of shaped around malls, for example. And so if you just think about this relationship, public space around malls incentivizing more consumption, when the emissions that probably are coming strongly from that, from different value chains. So what is that telling us for the future of cities? Is perhaps a challenge that we need to look at, and it's maybe even connected to just the vision that we have on the economy and the future of economy as well. So something to think about for sure. And then just on the second question, Stephen, that you mentioned about empowering people, I think I can bring an example here from Berlin. So I'm also part of this civil society group that recently just was, well, not recently, but throughout the last years, were doing campaigns with the mechanism of the deliberative democracy, which is a mechanism through which if you have enough signatures of citizens here in Berlin, you can ask for different things. So, for example, one year we managed to get a climate citizen assembly, which was a form of representative democracy. So that meant for that year that so basically we managed to get enough signatures, and that went through the municipality, and then we had that the climate citizen assembly, and so that was a kind of a sample of that was representative of the Berlin demographics. And then regular citizens were taken through a journey where they would discuss with scientists, and then they would come up with their own suggestions on how to make the city carbon neutral. But then this year it was a different, this couple of years, last year, we were on a different track, which was again start a campaign to get a referendum for the city of Berlin, to make the overall target of mitigation more ambitious. So we were asking for a law to make Berlin climate neutral by 2030, and then there's this mechanism that we can get it through a referendum. So right now, just a couple of weeks ago, again we collected enough signatures, which was around 260,000 signatures, and with that, the city then has to do this referendum and ask the overall population if we want a more ambitious target. So this is just one example of how, of course, when it comes to policies and to these big goals, in a way, the government is. Yeah, they are already doing a lot in many European cities, but we know from science that we're not doing enough. So anything that we can make to make it more ambitious and to put a bit of pressure on those goals, I think is worth is worth the try, because the citizens there may be, of course, we can take different decisions through our consumption patterns and even the choice of where we live or not, what energy we use and so on in the city. But sometimes there's a constraint of the policy. So what to do with that, right? So I think the deliberative democracy mechanism is just one interesting mechanism through which regular citizens can push in an organized way, and it's all about the collective, but can push a bit farther the ambition of their, in this case, local government, right? Because it's about city governance. So yeah, so that would be my contribution to that.
Well, I think what you're talking about there, I think, is reflective of something that I'm seeing more and more attention paid to and work being done on, which is participatory futures, and really creating these national dialogues, city level dialogues, regional level dialogues, and listening sessions where people are able to share their visions of what they want the future of their city, their region to look like, and in such a way that they really can be taken into account in a meaningful way by the policymakers who are making decisions about the futures of those areas. I want to ask one more question and pose it to all three of you before we take the remainder of our time to take some of the questions from the audience. And it goes back to something you talked about earlier, Karim, when you were talking about technology and data, particularly in the mobility field. But if we think about the vision that has been, not just the vision, the reality that has been developed over the last decade or decade plus of smart cities, that vision is very rooted in fourth industrial revolution technologies like AI, like autonomous systems, Internet of Things, very sophisticated data analytics platforms and engines. For all of you to comment on, if you would, what are some of the primary benefits that you see from a sustainability standpoint and a future sustainability standpoint that those kinds of technologies can bring to bear in cities? But at the same time, how can we also ameliorate some of the real risks that those technologies pose from the standpoint of a corporatization of governance, potential misuse of data, hackable cities, right? There are real risks or potential downsides to these technologies, as well as the benefits that they could bring. And I'd love to hear from each of you briefly on kind of both sides of that equation. Can I start with you, Adam?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for us, again, going back to the fact that when you're designing a city, you don't have a lot of user data. But you can, of course, take the patterns. And so I think what's important in a place where you're building a new city is to actually look at, what the patterns are of data use and what is driving them. So the analysis of these data patterns from other cities, and maybe it's trying to look for the cities that have the most applicability to the issues that you're attempting to tackle, whether that be climatic conditions, geographical conditions, right, in terms of the landscapes. So a lot of what's being attempted in these cities is to actually try to use that information from other patterns that AI is able to help discern and break down. And of course, the processing of the data gives you a lot more insights. And then the question is, how do you take those insights and apply them to what is essentially, and not to downplay technological evolution, but the technologies that we're employing, some of them have the base in 200-year-old technologies, i.e. trains, right? We have 100-year-old plus technology in terms of buses or shared mobility. And so we talk a lot in cities like Neom about the shared mobility. And I think what we're learning is taking the lessons from other cities on how to adapt that. So what the focus in a place like Neom is then shared mobility, right? Whether that be obviously on bigger things like trains, different types of trains, but also in terms of call it rubber tired type experiences where you have shuttles or buses, those sort of things. So these are not brand new technologies, but in the same way, existing cities are trying to adapt these sort of older technologies to a new reality. When you have a brand new city, what you can do is take a couple of jumps forward and try to take these, let's call them legacy technology, update them with technological advances. So obviously when we're talking about the trains, we're not talking about the trains from the early 19th century, but high-speed trains, highly efficient trains, things like that. But it really is trying to, is using these patterns, this technology to adapt these technologies to new circumstances and to allow them to be able to really provide a higher level of service. Because when you make the commitment towards shared mobility and a focus away from any single-use vehicles, or the majority or the huge majority of the trips need to be in shared mobility, that creates a lot of challenges, right? Because we have, over the last, say, 100 years, part of the revolution in transport in cities, which may have a lot of downfalls, has given people this personal control, right? Why do people like the car? They like it because it's their space. It takes them from point A to point B. Now, it creates a lot of problems. You have to provide all these lanes of highways. They consume a lot of energy. You have to park them somewhere. But what I think that the opportunities for this technology is to use it to look at the examples from around the world, what works and what doesn't work, and try to, as you build out, not make the same mistakes. So it's a lot about interpreting that data and then applying those lessons, because you can have the lessons. How you apply them is the real challenge, going back to what I talked about. But it is a huge opportunity that new cities have.
Great, thank you. In just a minute or two from you, Melissa, and then you, Karim, on the same question about the upsides and the potential downsides of these technologies in cities. We've got a little less than 15 minutes left, so I'd like to hear quickly from each of you on that and leave the remainder of our time for a few audience questions. Melissa?
Thank you, Stephen. I think I would just like to focus on two dimensions of urban design and the relationship with technology. One being knowledge production, and I think already mentioned there are many things coming there, from AI to sensors. And I want to actually talk about immersive technologies a bit, because this one, I think I've been a lot more excited about this technology, not in the way that this virtual reality or augmented reality is creating a stronger divide between presencing and being, experiencing nature from first-hand, senses. But one use that I thought it was interesting is something called sensorial augmentation or sensorial hacking, in the way that with a lot of these immersive technologies, there are more artistic examples, not so much in the actual urban design, but it's still worth mentioning. mentioned this, artistic examples where they are simulating the sensorial worlds of other species. So basically, this is interesting for me in the sense that we are, if we face the challenge of designing for other species, we are assuming a lot about their subjectivities of other species, how different species perceive the world, and so on. So I think the examples that I saw with immersive technologies, where they're able to recreate, of course, based on science, the science of the sensorial ecology or sensorial biology, so the science of how different species perceive the electromagnetic spectrum to different acoustic senses that they have. So all of these things are informing these more embedded experiences of other species realities. And I think that one I felt is interesting because it's not just about having more data, but it's also about how we experience that data and how that experiences can create or not more empathy towards something else than just us. So this I think I felt it's a promising use, and it can kind of decenter our human perception when we want to imagine different futures as well, thinking about cities now. And then the second example that I want to bring is more on materialities. So of course, a big question that we have to face when it comes to sustainability is what it's the future of materials when we talk about building and construction and so forth. And there are many things happening with biodesign that can be applied to architecture. And so there are many things like biofabrication that are helping us to co-design and co-build with different species, being that bacteria or mycelium. And so I think this is also a promising field, as long as it enables us to collaborate and not exploit nature in a different way. But I think there are interesting things that we can see, for example, with how we can create scaffolds with soil, 3D printed soil or other substrates to, for example, co-create a space with mycelium, which can grow then on these 3D printed surfaces and so on. So examples like this, I feel like they're interesting because they're bringing the question of how we can relate to other species and co-create with other species. Yeah, so I leave it at that for the time.
Great, thank you. That's fascinating, right? The use of these technologies, not just to get data, but to get a different perspective, I think is part of what I hear you talking about. Kareem, quickly from you on this question about technologies before we spend our last few minutes with a couple of audience questions.
Sure. So technologies are technologies. They serve certain agendas. They're not necessarily driven by climate. They're not necessarily driven by any ideology, if you like. So smart city technologies are driven by a desire for digitalization. The digital evangelists around the world want to use technology wherever it works, wherever it can serve. So they can obviously provide a lot of efficiencies when those efficiencies are economic and when they're related to user experiences. And we've seen that, and the examples are numerous. However, because their bottom line ultimately is commercial viability, because they're technologies that need to be commodified and sold, ultimately they don't always serve a climate goal. So for one example is the cannibalization of Uber, cannibalizing public transportation. We've seen cities around the world where it's cheaper to subsidize an Uber journey with $5 than it is to build a public transportation network. And that provides door-to-door. So great, the technology has certainly provided commercial benefits to the users. It has provided a door-to-door experience for the users, and the municipality is now off the hook. They don't need to provide public transportation. As a result, we have higher emissions because we ended up with all these private vehicles running around. So the issue, I think, with smart city technologies is that they're not always aligned. The other downside that I would point to is surveillance. A lot of smart city technology applications in the MENA region are about surveillance. And yes, it's certainly beneficial, but it can be used for purposes that could invade privacy, etc. So the sort of the climate person in me is a little bit skeptical about smart city technology and doesn't want to jump in head first into adopting every technology available out there until we are sure that it serves the agendas. There are competing agendas in cities around the world and in the region, and some of those agendas, in my opinion, are more pressing than others.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're touching on something that is a, kind of a fundamental idea in futures work of all kind, and that's, thinking through the second and third and fourth order consequences of technological innovations or any other kind of innovations. Absolutely. Let me, in our remaining few minutes here, we've got a few questions from the audience. Let me start with this one. It's a question from Nadine Bitar, and it says, in the GCC, there are more than 20 new cities that have already been planned and built. How can we capture the lessons of these developments going forward for upcoming developments in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the region, especially when it comes to sustainable human development? I think, without talking about any of the specific city projects that any of you may or may not have been involved in, I think the question is, how can we take the lessons from across these many projects and proactively think about how to use them in future projects? Let me pose that to any of you.
Well, I mean, look, just jumping in right there. I mean, there have been, and I don't think it's only complete cities. I mean, I would also maybe add into this, major transformations of areas within cities, right? And whether they be suburbs or whatnot, because there have been a number of urban redevelopment projects and massive sort of area plans. I think though I would sort of put them all together. And there's been, I without going one by one, obviously both for time and other reasons, I think there's been easily as many failures as there have been successes in terms of, what has developed and what has come to pass. And some of those come down to like economics or particular other issues that have come up, political. But then there are some fundamentals in terms of, having to make these big guesses, because at any one time when you're building in advance of development, and I talked about this earlier, often established cities around the world are always running to catch up. So you should know the patterns that you're trying to respond to. The challenges on these new cities is that they've had to make guesses. And no matter how smart the people are, no matter how much data they've been able to rely on, I think there's consistently been technology that hasn't quite come to pass in its viability. It looks good, maybe it doesn't work in the long run, or it's very expensive to implement. It also, you were able to see when you make really big investments, like in terms of what patterns of people are going to want. And you've seen this even in other cities, transportation. I'll give you an example. There was huge moves around lots of cities in North America around things like helipads, and going out of the 50s, like everyone was going to have a private helicopter, not everyone, but large populations. And clearly, this hasn't come to pass. And so you see a lot of these examples of technology that was supposed to majorly transform the region. So I think the lesson is, at the highest level, if you could, is trying to keep your specificity in terms of one technology to a limit. So try to keep it as broad and multi-platformed. So at the very basic level, and then maybe I'll let some others answer too. And I have this advantage now focusing on roads. Road is a pretty basic form of technology, but it enables a whole series of other advances that uses AI and different technologies as a platform that you could imagine. It uses micromobility, it uses, these new ride sharing, microtransit, all of these adaptations, you wouldn't necessarily have to have predicted in order of building a road. That's a very simplistic view of it, but it is an example of how you can use a very basic technology, but allow industry around and other things to evolve and use your basic infrastructure, because that, will be required regardless of what is going to come. Other things could come, flying cars, whatever, but you're still at the heart of it going to require something that basic. So focusing on basic infrastructure and allowing adaptivity over time is probably an important lesson, I would think.
That's great. And I think you point out, right, we need to learn the lessons from failures as well as successes, right? It's easy to think, let's take the successes and carry them forward. How do we make sure we decline to take the failures forward? There's another question here that's directed to you, Kareem, but I think, Melissa, you may have a perspective on this as well. It's from Louisa Mameri. It says, Kareem, you were speaking about the principle of subsidiarity that is practiced, at least at the EU, when you called for a multi-level governance system, weren't you? How is this different from the multi-level governance system you've mentioned? And if we considered multi-species stakeholders in processes such as climate change, how would this multi-level system need to look? Perhaps you could apply this to a case in the MENA region.
Yes, the answer is yes. It's the same principle. I'm just looking at it from a climate lens. I worry about the climate governance system and the role of cities within that. I think the question here is looks at it from an overall governance and the role of cities in general, and devolution and subsidiarity, etc. So yes, that's my take on it, only from a climate action in cities perspective. But I'll leave Melissa to chip in with new insights.
Yes, so something that is actually it's not an answer, it's more of a question, because I've been wondering around. So sorry, just to phrase it again. The development of many cities across the world, especially industrialized country, has the cost of their development is being assumed by when in terms of climate is being assumed by different places outside of that city. So it's kind of costing the climate that. And then if you see this relationship between developed cities and then the most vulnerable cities to the effects of climate change, you see a relationship that is really trespassing any governance boundary. So it's more of a question of how do we deal with that when we think about the development of new cities, and of course just in relation to the emissions, what is the responsibility of cities to be accountable for their emissions in relation to how each emission that we put out there is contributing to an increment of temperature that it will impact other parts of the world, because so far the way that we see governance is also it's within the it's not even binding way in which whatever global climate goal that we have is really has to be enacted by the country, but it's more given on the on a promise kind of level. So I'm just trying to think what is how do we also rephrase our governance systems when decisions that we're taking at the city levels, developing new cities, can come at a cost that is beyond that realm. And I have no answer for that, but it's just more of a question that I think it's still open, and we're trying to figure out at every level how to adapt our governance systems to tackle this issue. But it's really a cross-scale dynamic that maybe so far we are failing to achieve something at the global scale, but it's something to think about. Then the other aspect of multi-species stakeholders, I think there was something around that in that question. And maybe I just bring the example of this movement of rights of nature, which might be interesting from the point of view where this philosophy of taking into account nature, if I can say it, needs to be operationalized in specific legal systems. So with the rights of nature movement, we have seen in different cases ways in which the rights of nature or the personhood of nature, being that either a river or a specific species or the Amazon in the case of Colombia, where this is translated into either the constitution, that was the case of Ecuador, or into a regulation or a policy at the level of either the region or the city. So there are many ways in which we can take nature as a stakeholder and translate that into a legal system, depending, of course, on the specific government context of a place. But I think this is also another way in which we can bring something that sometimes feels a bit abstract into a specific rules of governance back into a context.
Great, thank you. Well, we have not only run out of time, we've actually run a couple minutes over, and I think we could continue this conversation for quite a while longer if we had the time. I think this has been exactly the kind of conversation I was hoping we would have, focusing not just on the current challenges in cities in the Middle East and North Africa region, but really have heard from all of you on your thinking about what the future of these cities could potentially look like. And that's really kind of the focus of all of our work in this program at MEI, is thinking about alternative futures and what we can do in the near term to take steps in the direction of creating those futures. So I can't thank you enough, all of you, Adam Jambroni, Karim Elgendi, Melissa Ingaruka Moreno. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. And I hope we will have an opportunity to talk with you more about all of these issues in the future.